So just figure out what your sport requires, and that's what you should base your training off of. Not just some broad training methodology and then hoping it translates to your sport. Figure out what you need for your sport, reverse engineer it, and that's what your training should reflect. Okay, I'm back. About a week and a half late, but that is spilled milk under the bridge. So we're just gonna move on. So in part 2, I wanted to talk about kind of the 3 planes of motion, sort of breaking down the 3 planes of motion because they tend to be a little bit tricky for people. Guaranteed in the past, I've referred to one of these planes incorrectly, so it's one of those things that's not super intuitive. The point I was trying to make in that first video was that I would say 90% of the movements that are done in CrossFit, they're all done in the sagittal plane. So the easiest way to think of the sagittal plane is if you are facing forward and you have you have walls on either side of you that run on infinitely. So whatever you can do in that little narrow, we'll call it a sagittal hallway, that's what's done in the sagittal plane. So squats, thrusters, wall balls, any sort of overhead pressing movement with a elbow forward position, sort of a front rack Olympic position versus the wide position. If you end up with the elbows out wide, you end up in a different plane of motion. So as long as you're narrow with this movement, narrow grip push-ups, those are all done in the sagittal plane, walking, running. Basically any of the main CrossFit movements, if it looks like it's done from straight ahead, that's basically gonna be in the sagittal plane. The other 2 planes are frontal and transverse. Frontal plane, very quickly, if you were to imagine that you have a wall directly in front of you and a wall directly behind you, whatever movements you can do in between those 2 walls, that would be in the frontal plane. So in that range of motion, you're thinking lateral lunges, lateral raises, wide grip overhead press, maybe think of a military press, pull-ups, those are all done in the frontal plane. Last one, transverse plane. Just for the scope of this conversation, just think of anything with rotation, and that's basically the transverse plane. Floor pressing, bench pressing, that's also included in there, and also some other movements based on the positioning of your arms and your body. But just for simplicity's sake, just if you think of a rotational movement, you can consider it the transverse plane. That's usually a broad enough definition for most people. So it's important to understand those 3 planes of motion, not just in gym movements, but in life, because when you're thinking about your training should be working towards something, not just getting better in the gym. You ideally are getting better in life. Whether it's in sport, whether it's being able to play with your kids with less pain, you're gonna need all 3 planes of motion. So when you look at your training, you need to ask yourself, am I training all 3 planes of motion? If you're training exclusively CrossFit, you're gonna get freakishly strong in the sagittal plane, and you're gonna be neglecting the frontal and transverse plane. So in sport, my main concern is injuries, because if you train almost only doing CrossFit movements, you're gonna get very, very strong and very fast going forward and back, but you do so little lateral movement, all the muscles that are required to stabilize your knee and your ankle and keep your hip in a good position, those muscles are going to be underdeveloped. So if you try to cut, or if you get tackled and you land in a weird position, your body's not going to be able to buffer that position because you never train it. So it's not so much for like speed or athleticism or anything like that. CrossFit does a very good job at getting you strong, getting you fast, being able to jump higher. Like, it does those things for sure, but all of those things are done in a straight line. So outside of the 100-meter dash, you're really gonna need strength and mobility and flexibility in those various planes of motion, not just the sagittal plane, not just forward and back. Any sport that you watch, they're constantly moving through 3 planes of motion, so you need to be training those at a commensurate rate. So if you're an athlete, it makes sense to start looking at your sport and seeing which planes of motion am I using most. In my sport, am I more of a north-south player? Do I do a lot of east to west movement as well? And then there are a lot of rotational movement. So for rotational stuff, golfers, baseball players, quarterbacks, any sort of rotation through the torso, that's going to be your transverse plane. Running backs, they need to do a lot of spin moves, cutbacks. So just figure out what your sport requires, and that's what you should base your training off of. Not just some broad training methodology and then hoping it translates to your sport. Figure out what you need for your sport, reverse engineer it, and that's what your training should reflect.
Back on the street.